Look at this fossil. Someone's grandma got lost on her way to the library. The voice, sharp with the unearned confidence of youth, cut through the low hum of the Advanced Tactical Simulation Center. The crowd, a collection of the Naval War College's brightest and most ambitious cadets, chuckled in response. The laughter was a mix of nervous energy and genuine derision, a pack instinct kicking in to affirm the dominance of their chosen leader, Cadet Russo. They all turned to look at the subject of his scorn, a woman standing near the bulkhead, observing their preparations. She was perhaps 60, her hair a cascade of steel gray pulled back into a severe, functional bun that allowed no stray strands to escape. She wore simple, non-regulation khaki trousers and a plain navy blue polo shirt, a stark contrast to the crisp, uniform perfection of the cadets surrounding her. There was nothing about her that demanded attention. She was unremarkable, almost invisible, a ghost of gray and navy blue against the gunmetal gray of the facility. But when the senior instructor, a seasoned captain with eyes that had seen real horizons, saw her stance, he felt a flicker of something he couldn't name. It was a stillness, a centeredness that was utterly alien in this environment of pre-combat jitters and aggressive posturing. She stood with her feet planted slightly apart, a posture of perfect balance, as if she were feeling the deck of a ship rolling beneath her feet, even here, deep in the concrete heart of a terrestrial base. Her hands were clasped loosely behind her back, her gaze sweeping across the holographic displays, not with the unfocused awe of a tourist, but with the critical, appraising eye of a master artisan judging another's work. The cadets saw a frail, out-of-place administrator. The captain saw an unnerving economy of motion, an absolute lack of wasted energy that hinted at a lifetime of disciplined practice. If you believe that true strength is measured not in volume, but in substance, type competence below. The woman, Elara Vance, offered no reaction to the insult. Her expression did not shift. Her posture did not change. The laughter, the words, the collective stare of 24 cadets might as well have been a passing breeze. Her focus was absolute, directed inward on the task at hand, which at that moment was simply to observe. Russo, emboldened by her lack of response, continued his performance. He was the golden boy of his class, a chiseled specimen of military potential with a booming voice and an ego to match. He saw Vance as everything wrong with the modern Navy, a civilian bureaucrat, a pencil pusher, a committee member sent to dilute the warrior ethos with pointless oversight. To him, her presence in this sacred space, a crucible where the next generation of fleet commanders was forged, was an unforgivable intrusion. He gestured with a theatrical sweep of his arm. Seriously, what is she even doing here? Did she bring us cookies? Is she going to knit us a new battle plan? This is a war-fighting facility, not a retirement home. We're training to project power, to dominate the seas, and they send us a librarian to take notes. The snickering grew louder, more confident. The cadets, following Russo's lead, began to see her not as a person, but as a symbol of their own frustrations. They were the tip of the spear, and she was the dead weight of the bureaucracy they felt was always holding them back. They were the future, and she was the irrelevant past. Their assumptions, built on the shallow foundations of appearance and arrogance, began to solidify into a shared, unshakable truth. Her silence was weakness. Her age was obsolescence. Her civilian attire was ignorance. These became the pillars of their judgment, a verdict rendered without a single word of evidence ever being presented. They were wrong. The moment for the public shaming arrived during the gear stowage period before the simulation was to begin. Each cadet had a state-of-the-art tactical bag filled with hardened laptops, encrypted data slates, and personalized headsets. Elara Vance had only a simple, worn canvas duffel bag, the color of sand faded by 1,000 suns. It was an anachronism, a relic from a different era. She placed it carefully into an empty locker, the worn leather straps making a soft, sighing sound against the cold metal. As she stepped away to have a quiet word with the simulation technician, Russo saw his chance. A smirk spread across his face as he exchanged a look with his two closest acolytes. "Let's see what kind of top-secret paperwork the Grand High Administrator brought with her," he whispered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Probably a stack of procurement forms for more comfortable chairs." The cadets gathered around as Russo, with the dramatic flair of a stage magician, pulled the canvas duffel from the locker. He unzipped it, the sound loud in the suddenly quiet room. He reached inside, his expression one of feigned curiosity, and began to pull out the contents one by one, presenting each to his audience like a trophy. The first item was not paper, but an old, perfectly balanced naval officer's knife, its sheath worn smooth with time, the brass hilt gleaming softly under the harsh fluorescent lights. A few cadets shifted uncomfortably. It was a personal item, and this was beginning to feel like a violation. Russo, undeterred, pressed on. Next, he pulled out a thick, leather-bound journal, its pages filled not with printed text, but with dense, elegant handwriting and complex celestial navigation calculations, pages of stars and numbers that spoke of long, lonely nights on a dark sea. The final item was nestled at the bottom, wrapped in a small square of dark blue velvet. It was heavy for its size. Russo's arrogance peaked. And for the grand finale, he announced, the secret weapon of the administrative corps. He unwrapped the velvet with a flourish, revealing a small object carved from a dark, rich wood. It was a miniature ship's wheel, no bigger than the palm of his hand, each spoke and handle carved with painstaking, intricate detail. It was clearly old, the wood polished smooth by countless years of handling. Russo held it up for all to see, a cruel grin spreading across his face. A toy. She brought a little toy ship's wheel. Is she going to tell us a bedtime story about pirates before we start the simulation? Maybe it's her emotional support wheel. The room erupted in laughter, louder and more vicious this time. The last vestiges of restraint were gone. At that moment, Vance returned. She stopped at the edge of the circle of mockery, her eyes taking in the scene. She saw her personal effects laid out on the bench, her journal open, the small wooden wheel held aloft in Russo's hand like a spoil of war. The laughter faltered, dying in the cadets' throats as they turned to face her. They expected anger, tears, a demand for an apology. They were met with none of it. Her face was a mask of placid calm. There was no flush of embarrassment, no flicker of rage in her eyes. There was only a profound, unshakable stillness. With movements that were deliberate and economical, she walked through the parting cadets. She picked up the knife and slid it back into its sheath with a soft click. She closed her journal and placed it in the bag. Finally, she walked to Russo, who still held the small wooden wheel. She held out her hand, her gaze steady and direct. Wordlessly, his bravado evaporating under her silent scrutiny, he placed the object in her palm. She gently rewrapped it in the velvet and placed it in her duffel. She then zipped the bag closed, the sound echoing in the cavernous silence that had fallen over the room. She had not uttered a single word. Her silence was a mirror, and in it, the cadets suddenly saw the ugliness of their own behavior. Her complete refusal to be diminished by their cruelty somehow diminished them instead. The air grew thick with a new kind of tension, not of anticipation for the war game, but of a deep and unsettling uncertainty. They had made a terrible assumption, and the quiet dignity of their targets suggested that their judgment had been profoundly, catastrophically flawed. The simulation began, and the atmosphere of quiet unease was immediately shattered by the blare of a klaxon signaling enemy contact. On the main holographic display, a three-dimensional map of a contested strait materialized. Friendly blue icons, representing their carrier strike group, were shown sailing directly into a perfectly executed ambush. Red icons, representing enemy ships, submarines, and aircraft, bloomed across the map like a fatal disease, cutting off their line of retreat. The scenario, codenamed Unwinnable Labyrinth, was a legendary meat grinder, a nightmare designed by the college's most sadistic tacticians to test a commander's grace under catastrophic failure. The cadets, with Russo at the helm as the designated strike group commander, plunged into the fight with textbook ferocity. They launched fighters, deployed countermeasures, and maneuvered their ships according to the doctrine they had spent years memorizing. But for every move they made, the simulation's advanced AI had a perfect counter. Their long-range missiles were spoofed. Their fighter screens were flanked by stealth aircraft appearing from impossible vectors. Their destroyers, sent to hunt for submarines, were torn apart by torpedoes fired from deep within an acoustic shadow they couldn't penetrate. The command center, which had been a hub of confident shouts and crisp commands, devolved into a frantic cacophony of panicked reports and confused questions. "We've lost the Princeton," one cadet yelled. "Multiple inbound anti-ship missiles. I can't track them all," screamed another. Russo, his face pale and beaded with sweat, was losing control. His confident orders became desperate pleas. The textbook had failed him. His arrogance, so potent against an unarmed woman, was useless against a truly superior adversary. The blue icons winked out one by one, consumed by the relentless red tide. The simulation was a rout, a complete and utter humiliation. The supervising captain watched with a grim expression, his disappointment palpable. He had seen failures before, but this was a total collapse of command and control. He was about to terminate the simulation and begin the brutal after-action report when a quiet movement in the darkened corner of the room caught his eye. It was Alara Vance. She had been observing from the periphery, a silent shadow amidst the chaos. Now, she was moving. She did not ask for permission. She did not announce her intentions. She simply walked from the shadows toward a secondary and used tactical console, her steps as calm and measured as if she were taking a stroll through a garden. The captain opened his mouth to order her back, to demand what she thought she was doing, but the words died in his throat. There was an aura of absolute, unshakable authority in her bearing. It was the way she moved, the way she carried herself, that spoke of a lifetime spent in rooms exactly like this one, in moments exactly like this. He hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, history turned. Vance sat down at the console, her back straight, her posture perfect. Her hands, the same hands that had so carefully repacked her bag, hovered over the controls for a brief second before descending. The battle for the carrier group was about to be decided not by a cadet's frantic shouting, but by the quiet, deliberate movements of a silent old woman. Vance's fingers danced across the console, but it was not the frantic, percussive typing of the cadets. Her movements were fluid, deliberate, and impossibly precise, like a concert pianist conjuring a symphony from ivory keys. She ignored the flashy, three-dimensional holographic display that had so mesmerized the younger officers. To her, it was a distraction, a pretty illusion that obscured the hard, cold truth of the battle space. Instead, she brought up windows of raw, cascading data that the cadets had dismissed as background noise. She analyzed raw SIGINT intercepts, cross-referencing them with satellite thermal imaging of the water surface. She pulled up detailed charts of ocean currents, salinity levels, and thermal layers, mapping the very structure of the ocean itself. To the cadets, the battle was about ships and missiles. To Vance, it was about the environment, the system in which the battle was taking place. She began to input commands, not for the entire fleet, but for individual assets, making tiny, almost imperceptible adjustments. She ordered a single destroyer to alter its Emkin state, going completely passive for precisely 97 seconds, making it a ghost in the electromagnetic spectrum. She adjusted the flight path of one E-2 Hawkeye surveillance plane by a mere 2 degrees, just enough to use the radar shadow of a massive civilian container ship to mask the approach of her own submarine. She identified a deep, cold thermal layer in the water column, a natural anomaly that the enemy AI, programmed to anticipate standard naval doctrine, had categorized as an impassable acoustic barrier. The cadets had seen it as a wall. Vance saw it as a hidden highway. She sent her last remaining submarine diving into that layer, positioning it directly beneath the enemy's command and control submarine. She wasn't fighting their ships. She was dismantling their network. She wasn't countering their attacks. She was corrupting their data. She fed their intelligence network a stream of ghost signals and false targets, turning their greatest strength, their seamless flow of information, into their most fatal weakness. The overwhelming enemy force, moments before a perfectly coordinated engine of destruction, suddenly began to stutter. Their targeting solutions flickered and failed. Their formations, once a model of lethal geometry, became disjointed and confused. A flight of enemy bombers, vectored toward the carrier, inexplicably turned and flew out to sea, chasing a phantom signal Vance had created. The enemy flagship fired a full salvo of missiles, not an American cruiser, but at a ghost target she had projected 3 miles away. On the main screen, the result of her quiet work became terrifyingly clear. A single red icon, representing the enemy's lead submarine, the nerve center of their entire operation, suddenly blinked and went dark. A simple text confirmation appeared on Vance's screen. Target neutralized, then another icon. An enemy cruiser vanished. Then an entire squadron of aircraft. The blue forces, on the brink of annihilation, were now methodically picking apart a blind and bewildered enemy. A profound, deafening silence descended upon the command center, the frantic shouting replaced by the low, steady hum of the cooling fans. The cadets stared, their faces a mixture of awe, confusion, and dawning horror. Russo's mouth hung open, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked from the tactical display, where a losing battle had been transformed into a flawless victory, to the quiet old woman at the secondary console. He had mocked her. He had called her fossil, a librarian, and she had just executed a strategy so brilliant, so far beyond the scope of his comprehension, that it felt less like tactics and more like prophecy. In that moment of shattering revelation, the foundation of his entire world, his confidence, his training, his perceived superiority, crumbled to dust. He had not just made a mistake. He had committed an act of sacrilege. Lieutenant Miller, the officer responsible for running the simulation, stood frozen in place. His job was to monitor the cadets' performance, to guide them through their failures, and to compile the data for their review. But what he had just witnessed transcended any training exercise. He had watched a master at work, and a cold dread mixed with electrifying awe washed over him. He had heard whispers, old sea stories told by gray-haired master chiefs in the quiet hours of a mid-watch, tales of a legendary wargamer from the height of the Cold War, a strategist who could think like a machine and dismantle entire fleets without firing a shot. The name was always spoken with a kind of reverence. Oracle, he had dismissed them as myths, the kind of tall tales that sailors love to spin. But the techniques he had just seen Vance employ, the subtle manipulation of environmental data, the use of passive systems as offensive weapons, the psychological warfare waged against the enemy's command logic. They were signatures, a fingerprint of a strategic philosophy he had only ever read about in heavily classified, long-forgotten doctrinal papers. Shaking himself from his stupor, Miller walked with purpose past the shell-shocked cadets. His destination was not the main console, but a secure terminal in the corner of the room used for accessing classified personnel files. He keyed in his credentials and then a high-level override code, his fingers moving with a new urgency. He pulled up the official visitor manifest for the day. There was her name, Vance Ilera. Status, civilian observer, Dawn Special Project Division. It was a common enough cover for high-level consultants and visiting dignitaries. But Miller had a hunch, a terrible, wonderful suspicion. He clicked on her name, accessing the attached service record. Most of it was a wall of black, redacted lines, a testament to a career spent in the shadows. But his clearance level allowed him to see one critical, unredacted file attachment, a single line of text that made the air rush from his lungs. Attached file, Project Kraken. Declassification, indefinite. Last active billet, Commander, Task Force 16. Call sign, Oracle Russo, who had moved closer, trying to understand what was happening, overheard the lieutenant's sharp intake of breath, and saw the words on the screen. Task Force 16. A ghost unit. a Black Ops command that officially never existed, rumored to be responsible for some of the most sensitive strategic operations of the Cold War. And the call sign, Oracle. The myth was real. The legend was standing in the room with them. Miller slowly turned away from the terminal, his face pale, his eyes filled with an expression of profound, unadulterated respect. He walked directly toward Vance, who had finished her work and was now standing quietly, observing the final, inevitable cleanup of the remaining enemy forces on the screen. He moved with a formality that seemed out of place in the high-tech chaos of the room, each step deliberate and measured. He stopped precisely 3 feet in front of her, in the dead, echoing silence of the command center, surrounded by the humbled cadets. Lieutenant Miller drew himself to his full military height. He raised his hand to his brow, his fingers perfectly aligned, and executed the sharpest, most impeccably formal salute of his entire career. It was not the perfunctory gesture offered to a superior officer. It was an act of homage. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and steady, ringing with a reverence that bordered on worship. "Admiral," he said, the word cutting through the silence like a blade. "My apologies. We did not recognize you." He addressed her by the rank she must have held at her retirement, a rank that was nowhere in her file, but was the only thing that made sense of the impossible feat he had just witnessed. The word Admiral hung in the air, a sonic boom that shattered the last remnants of the cadets' composure. It was an impossibility, a paradox. The woman before them, in her simple civilian clothes, with her quiet demeanor and her grandmotherly appearance, was a 4-star flag officer. Russo felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The chasm between his perception and reality was so vast it threatened to swallow him whole. Lieutenant Miller held his salute for a long, respectful moment before dropping his hand. He then turned to face the stunned cadets, his expression transforming from one of reverence for her to one of cold, controlled fury for them. His voice, when he spoke again, was low, but it carried an authority that was more devastating than any shout. "All of you," he began, his gaze sweeping across the room and finally landing on Russo with the force of a physical blow, "are here to learn how to fight ships. This Admiral," he gestured respectfully toward Vance, "spent her career teaching the machines how to think. You spend your nights reading the books on naval strategy. She is the one who wrote those books." He let the statement sink in, a heavy silence amplifying its weight. He took a step toward the main holographic display, which now showed a placid blue sea, the battle won, the enemy erased. This scenario, unwinnable labyrinth, you treated it like a tactical problem. You failed to realize it was a logic puzzle. It was designed 40 years ago by a brilliant young officer as her graduation thesis at this very college. Its purpose is not to test your knowledge of fleet maneuvers, but to test your ability to adapt when the rules you have memorized no longer apply. This Admiral designed it. A collective gasp went through the room. They had been fighting a ghost, trying to beat the creator at her own game. The arrogance of it was staggering. Miller wasn't finished. He pointed a rigid finger toward the locker room, in the direction of Vance's duffel bag. "And that toy you so publicly mocked, Cadet Russo, that little wooden ship's wheel. That is the original, hand-carved conceptual model she used to brief the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the Hollander Doctrine in 1986. A doctrine that redefined naval engagement in the North Atlantic. A doctrine that is, to this day, still classified top secret and is credited with preventing at least one escalation that could have led to a Third World War." He turned his piercing gaze back to Russo, whose face had drained of all color. "You thought you were making fun of Clerk. You thought you were asserting your place as a future warrior. You did not disrespect an observer. You desecrated a living monument of naval history. You stood in the presence of greatness, and all you could see was your own reflection. Your performance today, in every conceivable metric, was a failure. But your failure of character is far greater than your failure of tactics. Dismissed, the final word was an execution. The cadets, avoiding eye contact with each other, with Miller, and most of all with Vance, shuffled out of the room in shamefaced silence. Russo was the last to leave, his shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat, the golden boy tarnished beyond recognition. Vance had not said a word through the entire exchange. She simply stood, a silent, powerful testament to the truth that competence needs no defense, and respect, when it is truly earned, is absolute. The story of what happened in Sim 7 spread through the Naval War College not like wildfire, but like a pressure wave from an underwater detonation, silent, powerful, and felt everywhere at once. It wasn't mere gossip. It was the birth of a legend. The Oracle of Sim 7 became the new institutional myth, a cautionary tale whispered in mess halls, study groups, and late-night Barack Bull sessions. Cadets who hadn't even been in a room could recount every detail. The mockery, the silent response, the impossible victory, and the final, devastating reveal. Instructors, recognizing a teaching moment of unprecedented power, began to incorporate the story into their lectures on leadership, humility, and the mortal danger of making assumptions. The digital recording of the simulation, initially slated for routine deletion, was classified at the highest level and archived for study by the Navy's top strategists. It became a digital artifact, a perfect recording of a master's brushstrokes, to be analyzed for decades to come. The incident fundamentally altered the culture of the institution. The casual arrogance of the top-tier cadets was replaced by a new, more thoughtful sense of caution. They began to look at the civilian support staff, the technicians, the analysts, the administrators, with a new flicker of uncertainty, wondering what hidden depths might lie beneath a simple, unassuming exterior. The lesson was learned. The most dangerous person in the room is often the one you notice least. For Cadet Russo, the experience was not just humbling. It was an ego-shattering event that forced him to deconstruct and rebuild his entire identity. He was formally reprimanded, a black mark on a previously flawless record, but the institutional punishment was nothing compared to his own internal reckoning. His world, once a simple binary of the strong and the weak, the competent and the incompetent, had been revealed as a complex, nuanced landscape he was utterly unprepared to navigate. He spent his nights not in the simulator, but in the dusty archives of the college library. He searched for her name, E. Vance, and found it buried in the footnotes of declassified strategic papers from the late 20th century. He read about asymmetrical logic, about non-kinetic warfare, about using information as both a shield and a weapon. He began to understand that the world of conflict was infinitely more complex than he had ever imagined. He finally sought her out, finding her a few days later in a quiet observatory on the college grounds, charting star patterns with her old leather journal. He stood before her, stripped of all his former bravado, and delivered the most difficult words of his life. "Mom, Admiral, I was arrogant, and I was wrong. I have no excuse for my behavior." His apology was simple, direct, and utterly sincere. The golden boy was gone, replaced by a young man grappling with the first, painful pangs of genuine wisdom. Alara Vance looked up from her journal, her eyes calm and appraising. She studied Russo for a long moment, not with anger or disappointment, but with the dispassionate gaze of an instructor evaluating a student who had finally begun to ask the right questions. She offered a simple, almost imperceptible nod of acceptance. "Assumptions are the anchor that chains a strategist to the past, cadet," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of decades of experience. "You assumed you knew the battle space based on what you could see. That is the most dangerous assumption of all." Her words were not a rebuke, but a diagnosis, a precise identification of his core failure. Then, she did something that would alter the course of his life. In an act of profound and unexpected mentorship, she gestured for him to sit beside her. She opened her worn leather journal, its pages filled with the elegant script he had once seen as the ramblings of an old woman. "You and your classmates were fighting the enemy's ships," she explained, tapping a page filled with complex diagrams of ocean currents. "You were so focused on the red icons on the screen that you never saw the board itself. The ocean, the currents, the thermal layers, the salinity gradients. The ocean was your single greatest ally in that room, a force of nature with its own agenda, and you never once try to speak to it. You saw it as empty space. A fatal error. For the next hour, as the sun began to set, the legendary Admiral Vance sat with the disgraced cadet Russo and taught him how to see. She showed him how a subtle shift in water temperature could betray the presence of a deep-running submarine. She explained how the gravitational pull of the moon could be used to drift a fleet into a perfect firing position without using a single drop of fuel. She taught him to read the sea not as a surface, but as a three-dimensional world of hidden mountains, secret rivers, and invisible walls. She was not teaching him tactics. She was teaching him a new language, the language of the deep. This quiet act of grace, of passing on knowledge to the very person who had so publicly scorned her, became the true climax of the legend. Her victory in the simulator was a demonstration of power, but this was a demonstration of character. It cemented her legacy not as a remote, untouchable warrior, but as a wise and generous teacher. Later that week, Lieutenant Miller, with the full backing of the college's command staff, took the small, hand-carved wooden ship's wheel from Vance's duffel bag. It was carefully placed inside a climate-controlled glass case and mounted on the wall of the corridor just outside Sim 7. The brass plaque beneath it was simple, containing no mention of her rank, her famous call sign, or her litany of classified achievements. It read only, Admiral E. Vance. The ocean always speaks. You must learn to listen. The simulation room was never officially renamed, but from that day forward, among the cadets and faculty, it was known only by one name, the Oracle's Chamber. Months later, a new class of bright-eyed, confident cadets filed into the briefing room for their first session in the Advanced Tactical Simulation Center. They were the new best and brightest, filled with the same untempered certainty that had defined Russo's class before them. As they took their seats, their instructor, now Captain Miller, having been recently promoted, stood not before the holographic projector, but beside the small, reverently lit glass case on the wall. He let them settle, his silence drawing their attention until the only sound was the hum of the facility's environmental controls. "Before we begin," Miller said, his voice quiet yet commanding the full attention of the room, "I want to tell you a story. It's about this room, and it's about this." He gestured to the small wooden wheel in the case. He proceeded to tell them the story of Admiral Vance, of the Oracle of Sim 7. He didn't use it to intimidate them or to shame them before they had even begun. He used it as a foundational lesson. He spoke of the danger of assumptions, the poison of arrogance, and the immense, hidden power of quiet competence. He told them that the greatest warriors he had ever known were often the ones who spoke the least, who observed the most, and who understood that true strength was not about projecting dominance, but about possessing a depth of understanding that required no external validation. The story had been fully institutionalized. It was no longer a piece of gossip, but a core part of the college's curriculum on leadership. The lesson of Alara Vance, the quiet professional, the unassuming master, was now the first principle taught to every future commander who walked these halls. Her actions had created not just a victory, but a lasting, positive change in the very culture of the institution charged with training the Navy's leaders. The legacy she left was not a plaque on the wall, but a fundamental shift in perspective, a new sense of humility and intellectual curiosity instilled in a generation of officers. Her quiet competence had become the new gold standard. Her silent strength had become the lesson that echoed louder than any shouted command. Her legacy was now a living, breathing part of the Navy's future, a quiet wisdom passed from one class to the next. A year passed. Far away, in the turbulent waters of the South China Sea, the guided missile destroyer USS Donovan patrolled a tense and contested shipping lane. On its bridge stood Ensign Russo, no longer a cadet, but a newly minted officer of the line. He was calmer now, his youthful arrogance burned away and replaced by a quiet, watchful intensity. A crisis erupted suddenly. A long-range sensor detected multiple high-speed surface contact approaching at an ambiguous vector. The ship's tactical action officer, relying on the textbook, immediately identified them as hostile fast-attack craft and recommended a defensive posture, preparing to fire a warning salvo. The ship's captain, a man of aggressive instinct, was about to give the order. But Russo, his eyes glued, not to the primary tactical display, but to a secondary oceanographic sensor feed, saw something no one else did. A subtle, almost imperceptible anomaly. A slight but unnatural drop in the surface water temperature in the path of the oncoming contacts. It was a detail so minor it would have been dismissed as a sensor ghost by anyone else. But to Russo it was a voice. He remembered the quiet words of the Admiral in the observatory. "The ocean always speaks." "Captain, wait," Russo said, his voice steady and clear, cutting through the tension on the bridge. "Request we hold fire. That thermal anomaly, it's not natural. I think they're trying to draw us into a trap. The real threat isn't what's on the surface." He pointed to a different part of the chart. "It's what's using that cold water to hide underneath." The captain, surprised by the ensign's quiet confidence, hesitated. He looked at the data, saw the anomaly Russo had spotted, and made a decision. He trusted the quiet competence of his junior officer over the loud alarm of the tactical plot. He ordered the ship's advanced sonar to focus on the designated area. A moment later, the sonar operator's voice crackled with alarm. "Con, sonar. All new contact. Sierra 1, classified as hostile submarine, directly below the thermal layer." A disaster had been averted. The surface contacts were decoys, bait for a perfectly laid submarine ambush. The lesson of the Oracle had saved a ship and her crew. True legacy, the narrator concludes, is not the story of a single great action. It is not a monument you build to yourself. It is the wisdom you instill in others. It is the foundation you lay that allows those who come after you to see farther, to think deeper, and to listen more closely. It is the quiet competence that echoes not in the pages of history books, but in the critical decisions made on the bridges of ships, in the cockpits of planes, and in the hearts of leaders long after you are gone. It is the understanding that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the most important, and that true strength is proven not by what you say, but by what you enable others to achieve. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent strength defines true worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.